Hello and welcome. Richard Corben is a legendary underground artist. Quite possibly, his most well-known work is Den. It's what brought him to the forefront as an important underground artist, doing work that was unique and hard to categorize. Unlike other underground artists, Corben wasn't doing social commentary or autobiographical work. He did hyperbolic, overly sexualized fantasy stories. That was its appeal, and the source of all its criticism. Den was the ultimate expression of a male power fantasy. That's a bit dismissive to say, but not inaccurate. The male protagonist was buff and very capable in battle, and Den was also well endowed. The women were generally submissive and had large, improbable breasts. The threats were kind of basic, and usually represented as deformed or monstrous beings, so they were inhuman and deserved to die. There were many conquests on the battlefield and in the bedroom. Sure, one can read into the material and possibly come away with an attitude that is, well, incompatible with modern times. However, within the context of the fictional setting and the time it was produced, it's not a raging pile of misogyny, phobia, or racism. It's rather tempered, especially in comparison to other contemporary underground artists. So let's look at the beginnings of Corben's most well-known work. The creation of Den came from an unlikely source. He first appeared in a short, partially animated film. In 1968, while employed at an animation studio, Corben worked on the idea of transforming a live person into an animated drawing. What he produced impressed his boss, so the company funded the completion of a short film around this idea. The result was Neverwhere. This contained the basics that Corben would elaborate on years later. In the short film, a geeky guy who can't catch a date finds a glowing ball of light that he takes home. This ball of light then sketches out a schematic that the geek puts together and activates. A portal opens up, the geek enters, and the animated portion begins. Instantly, he's transformed into a buff, capable hero. Basically, he saves a woman from a bad guy and then returns home. All things considered, as a micro-budget project mainly done in his free time, it is surprisingly good. The animation might not be perfect, but it's not bad. In the live-action segments, the geek is portrayed by Corben, and the boss was his actual boss at the animation studio. Presumably, because the acting is terrible, the woman Corben hits on was someone else that worked in the office. The opening scene prominently features the major influence, Edgar Rice Burroughs' first John Carter novel, A Princess of Mars. The work of Robert E. Howard and H.P. Lovecraft will also influence Corben when he produces the first Den story. The other elements that carry over to the Prince story are the transformation of a geek into a buff, capable hero, and a schematic that creates a portal to Neverwhere. Corben quit his animation job to focus on comic book work. Primarily, he worked for Creepy, who published an impressive 40 stories over a period of 8 years. It was a mix of black and white material and full-color work. However, in 1970, he expanded into self-publishing with Fantagor Press. Within the undergrounds, he could write his own material, explore darker themes, and let his artwork be a little more unrestrained. Typically, Fantagor number 4 is cited as the first story set in Neverwhere. It doesn't have Den, but it does have a wizard that would appear in later Den stories. The first chapter of Neverwhere was published in Grimwit number 2 from 1973. This introduces Den and provides a modified origin from the short film. The schematic to build a portal to Neverwhere was found in a Burroughs novel that was left to him by a missing uncle. The portal is built so Den can find that missing uncle. He travels to Neverwhere and has a brief encounter with a woman in a bizarre headdress, trolling for prey. And that's all there was, a brief episode where the hero ends up in a strange land. In 1975, Corben was contacted by the publisher of a new magazine in France, Métal Hurlant. He was given the opportunity to have his work featured alongside the talents of Droulet and Moebius. Not to mention, his full-color work would be reproduced in a slick magazine format, which would represent his artwork better than newsprint. It was a dream offer. Corben then produced the 4-part first chapter of the Neverwhere saga. The first 2 parts were a translated version of the Grimwit story. and the 2 new parts introduced Cath, someone else who originated from Earth. Finally, in 1977, Heavy Metal launched in North America. Den was the lead story in the very first issue published. It would be featured in the next 12 issues, with the first 4 parts being reprints of previously published material. So Den had a very convoluted history, with a few stops and starts over a 5-year period, before finally reaching an end. Neverwhere has been collected and reprinted numerous times. The most recent version was published by Dark Horse in 2023. It's a beautiful edition, with Corben's colors faithfully reproduced, and it includes new digital lettering. The story opens with Den traveling to Neverwhere. He's confused and uncertain of who he might be. Seeing a structure in the distance, he walks towards it, where he finds food and water. Later, a bizarre naked woman walks out of the desert. She's followed by a lizard man, who probably doesn't have good intentions. Den follows them both to a temple, where he attacks the lizard man. Den loses the fight and falls out of view below a staircase. While unconscious, we learn of his origin. He's David Ellis Norman, a young man whose uncle, Daniel, has been missing for years and presumed dead. Among his possessions, David discovers a schematic in an Edgar Rice Burroughs novel and a letter addressed to him. Sensing the schematic is the key to locating his missing uncle, David builds the portal, activates it, and ends up in Neverwhere. As a side note, along with Burroughs, Howard, and Lovecraft, I think one could make an argument the Gore novels by the pseudonym John Norman might also be an influence. There's the simplicity of the names, Den and Gore. Although, Gore was the name of the planet, not the lead character. Gore was sexualized fantasy adventures like Den. The difference being, in Gore, these encounters were mainly non-consensual. Den's last name is Norman, like Gore's author. Finally, both share DNA with Burroughs' Barsoom novels. While I've not seen Corben acknowledge Gore, I don't think it's wild speculation to suggest there is an influence. End of side note. Waking up later, Den discovers a new crew at this temple. They are led by the Red Queen, who leads them in a ritual sacrifice of 2 humans. Den is unable to save the man, but he rescues the woman and escapes. By the way, the sacrifices are being made to an ancient evil whose name is Cthulhu spelled backwards. Here we learn the origin of Cath. The woman's full name is Catherine Wells, a reference to H.G. Wells' wife. She followed a will-o'-the-wisp to a portal, much like the geek in the short film. Den has a brief flashback, with a panel that looks like it was taken directly from the film. And, like in the film, Cath mentions the Queen can create objects with her thoughts. Finally, there is Gel, the bad guy Den defeated in the film. Gel even mentions the fact they've met before, but Den doesn't remember the incident. Gel states that Cath is instrumental to the Queen's goal to raise an ancient evil, so she and Den must die to prevent that. Another fight and an escape ensues. Den and Cath end up the prisoners of another dubious character, Ard. Ard takes Cath prisoner and commands Den to obtain the magical item, Lochnar, from the evil queen. Lochnar is another reference. Prior to Den, Corben adapted the Robert E. Howard story, Bloodstar. The story contains a tribal chief named Lochnar. The spelling is slightly different, but its inclusion can't be coincidental. It was likely a nod to Howard and the barbarian swordplay he was famous for writing. Of course, Den has no choice but to steal this magical item and rescue Cath. The heist goes wrong, Den is captured, and the Queen spares his life for some private adult time. The Queen is informed the Lochnar has been stolen, so she takes out her anger on Den. Another escape happens, followed by a number of complications, and Den finally obtains the Lochnar and brings it to Ard. Like the Queen, Ard intends to sacrifice Cath and release Cthulhu. But Den gets the Lochnar, throws it at Cthulhu, and destroys the beast. Neverwhere is now safe. Considering its publishing history, Neverwhere can be forgiven if it suddenly changes gears and not everything is fluid. That said, it's probably the most straightforward of all the Den stories. One thing you'll discover if you read future volumes is that Corben wasn't exactly a stickler for continuity. Some characters get different but similar names, and their histories are convoluted and contradictory. I'm still trying to figure out the Red Queen's backstory. You have to go along with the inconsistencies and not think too hard about the details. There are also two different Dens. There's Daniel Norman and his nephew, David Ellis Norman. A third one shows up later in Penthouse Comics. I think it's implied that Daniel Norman was the geek Corben played, because I believe that's his name in the film, and it does seem to be canon. But I'm not positive about that. Regardless, it's an interesting twist there was a prior Den, with an entire backstory and reputation, which does get explored later. Speaking of films, there was a Den segment in the animated heavy metal movie from 1981. Tonally, it's not what you would expect, because the whole thing is played for laughs. On its own, it's pretty amusing, but it's not a good representation of what Corben was doing. Normally, most reviews of Corben's work focus almost exclusively on the artwork. The reason for that is obvious. It's otherworldly. Immediately, your brain sees it as something unreal, yet it has enough realism to contain a level of familiarity. When categorizing the art style, one could say Corben shared more traits with surrealist Salvador Dali than with anyone in the comic book medium. Surrealism has an intentional dreamlike quality, and Corben's work on Den definitely fits that definition. It's a fantasy, which by extension is a dream. To his credit, Corben wasn't shy about admitting that he exaggerated and emphasized physical attributes and characteristics. He downplayed any deeper reading of the material, especially as indications of his psychological profile. In fact, in interviews, he comes off as a reasonably private person. Like, he understood why interviewers would probe the depth of his psyche, but he didn't care to answer those types of questions. In fact, he did point out fairly often that he wrote and illustrated fantasy stories. They're not real, and they're not direct manifestations of his perverse internal demons. They're dreams, they're fantasies. Sure, one can read this as a touch defensive, or one can interpret that as an artist being bored when asked the same surface-level question repeatedly. Curiously, the first 2 pages of the second Den story seem to be directly addressing criticisms about the perceived misogyny and lack of agency most female characters had in Neverwhere. In it, Kath has matured and gotten tired of this male-oriented fantasy world. She wants to leave. Den, now trying to display some growth by wearing a suit, is frustrated that Kath finds sex and adventure tiresome. In other words, Den wants to remain in the dream, but Kath thinks it's time to grow up and act like adults. It's a less than subtle meta moment. The intent is to ask, why are you looking for reality in this outrageous fantasy world? By implication, infusing reality requires a level of self-awareness that would break the story. If the characters acknowledged they were in a surreal, male power fantasy pulp adventure, they'd be constantly questioning everything. They'd be asking questions, having arguments, and the story would stall as they tried to make sense of this bizarre, sometimes horrific world. So trying to ground Neverwhere is like trying to make sense of a dream. You're better off just accepting the experience instead of trying to make it feel rational. It's just total, uninhibited escapism in full, glorious Technicolor. Thank you for watching. As noted at the beginning, Patreon members get an uncensored version of this video. I also uploaded the full Neverwhere short film, so sign up and get the full Den experience. On this platform, that's not something I can do. Since I had nothing interesting to say about this image, I thought I'd share it here. I think it's kind of neat. Corben used the bat in Neverwhere on the cover of Bat Out of Hell. It's a striking image. I can see why he'd repurpose it. As always, thanks to all my fine supporters on Patreon and YouTube. If you can, please join up and help out this human-generated operation. Perhaps more than ever, that support is important, and I greatly appreciate everyone who helps keep the lights on. Thank you. Extra special thanks to Andrew Barton, Brian Deaton, Chapel Pluto, Constant Disappointment Records, Corey Drew, Doug Eberly, Edward Clayton Andrew, Francis De La Cruz, Green Man, James Graham, Jeff Nicholson, John Gaunt, John Nyukes, John Woolham, Matt Marino, Michael Shelton, Odin Ashcroft, Phil Sagan, Plutocracy, Ruby St. Dennis, Russell Bull, Shad Miller, Sicken, Spencer Estes, and Tom Granis. You are all justified and ancient.